Because if I want milquetoast terrible takes about why bin Laden is bad, I can just
Yeah.
go do anything else that I've done for the last 20 years, right? TikTok and the return of Osama bin Laden, or as I put it, bin Laden to Boogaloo. So yesterday, last night, and we have a TikTok here at Two Guys Talking History. One day I'll actually figure out how to use it. Anyway, last night on TikTok, some users discovered that Osama bin Laden had written a letter to the United States, more of a manifesto, really. Uh, the text of which is ridiculously difficult to find right now. I think I found one copy on Twitter. But the letter was talking about the rationales and justifications for the 9/11 attacks 2 or a year on, give or take. And 9/11 is I realize that the vast majority of my audience is significantly younger than me at this point. But I was alive for 9/11. I was alive for grainy pictures of bin Laden on the TV when his M19, his M1965 jacket hanging out there, uh, talking in Arabic, and the news anchors being really scared. So this is making me feel good and old at this point, right? And I'm sure you have an even more visceral reaction to the age.
Yeah.
Uh, yes. So like I was in seventh grade when 9/11 happened, and it was like the biggest thing that ever happened in my life. Um. So anyway, they found this letter, and they found parts of it. The TikTokers did they sympathized with. And here's the thing: I am somewhat reluctant to get terribly upset about what random people on social media are saying, because they're random people on social media. It's not like, you know, Joe McCarthy got up and started saying it, or Kevin McCarthy gets up and starts saying it, or Nancy Pelosi. Like, when Nancy Pelosi says let's bomb everyone, I think you should be concerned because she has the means with which to enact this thing. Like when some kid on TikTok discovers a 20-year-old letter, I don't necessarily think we should get very concerned about it, but never miss. No one ever misses an opportunity online to be uh, to have a good old moral panic about things, right?
Oh, yeah.
So Megan Kelly is sitting there going, "These parents have failed," and Wick did a whole panel on it yesterday, which I refused to watch. Because if I want milquetoast terrible takes about why bin Laden is bad, I can just
Yeah.
go do anything else that I've done for the last 20 years, right? So here's the
Exactly.
thing. This was an opportunity for people to kind of talk about what it means to look at these things, because I don't necessarily think that you shouldn't read bin Laden's letter, right? I don't necessarily think you shouldn't read things like Mein Kampf, uh, or Mao's Little Red Book. Just because someone does something horrible in history does not invalidate the things they produce as a source of historical learning. I think you'd think that's a pretty fair statement, Commander.
Oh, yeah.
And
I'd
like,
I'd probably go even a little further and say there are always kernels of truth in a vast sea of crap.
yeah, I was going to put it a little differently. I was going to kind of point out that even if you read these things, I don't even think it's wrong necessarily to empathize with the writers and the people who have done these things, to understand why they might have wanted to do this. Why do you get up? Like the example I gave yesterday when some people were asking me about this is on 9/11, we were obviously all shocked that people would fly airplanes into buildings. This was a novel horror visited upon the world. Um, but like nobody questions the motives, for example, of the people trapped in those towers who jumped off to avoid dying in the collapse. And
Yeah.
if we could empathize with that person who jumps off the tower, because our instinct, right? Our natural instinct as human beings is to fight for every second of life we have. So if we can empathize and put ourselves in a position to understand why the person jumps from the tower, then we can do the same thing for the pilot of the plane who rammed it. And we could do the same thing for Adolf Hitler and Osama bin Laden. It doesn't mean I endorse what they believe. It doesn't mean I endorse what they did, but it means that I have the mental capacity required to analyze it, right?
Sure.
So, like,
But
this,
I think a lot of it is that we're bound up by Judeo-Christian ethic, which says that, suicide is evil. And that was the one thing that caught the U.S., particularly the Navy, who war gamed out World War II in the Pacific hundreds of times. That was the only thing about the war that caught us by surprise, is when the Japanese instituted kamikaze tactics. It was something so completely outside our understanding of normal human behavior. And, you have to ask yourself, well, what pushes somebody to a point where they believe that is a viable option?
yeah, and I think there's
And
a
what,
very similar pattern to kind of follow too, frankly.
yeah, and I
What
think when you understand it, that gives you a great deal of insight into
what
why they
happens,
did
right?
it that way.
So,
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
Japan is choosing kamikazes because the efficacy of their air force versus the American naval aviation arm is diminishing. They're not coming back. It's a zero-sum game to take to the sky. So, at that
Yeah.
point, what else is there? Like, this is the option I have, right?
Yep.
You can say the same thing about terrorist attacks. 60s, 70s, 80s, less so the 90s. Uh, Airplane hijackings all the time. Regular occurrence. Uh, they were very successful when they started doing these airplane hijackings of getting their way.
Yep.
We started to get very good at killing terrorists who took hijacked airplanes. So all of a sudden, the option is viable. The old tactic is no longer viable. Let's pick something new and more extreme. From a purely tactical sense, it makes sense.
Yeah.
Horrifying, but
Precisely.
it makes sense. Um, so I probably should have noticed Al Qaeda a little bit more readily in the 90s. To be perfectly blunt, uh, they tried to attack the World Trade Center before. Uh, they attacked the USS Cole. A couple other events of
Mhm.
significance that we should have noticed, but we didn't. And all of a sudden, 2001 comes around 9/11, and the whole world just suddenly is lit up by what Al Qaeda did. We now know who Al Qaeda is. Osama bin Laden becomes a household name um,
Yeah.
overnight, and it just changes. Uh, I quite ashamed to admit I used to watch a lot of Bill Maher back then. He was different. I swear to God, wasn't old man yells at cloud like he is now.
Yeah.
Uh, he was kind of funny back then, and like it was the Bush years. Things didn't feel as serious as they do now. So like someone clowning on Bush for a couple hours every Friday night was fun. Um, we have a particular set of dialogue that kind of emerged in the United States, and we have kept this dialogue going uh, in the general population ever since then. And we sort of forgot about it for a while, right?
Yep.
Because we stopped caring about, for example, we stopped caring about Afghanistan until the withdrawal started happening. And then everyone and their mother became an armchair general who was telling everyone how to win the war in Afghanistan. And I'm like, where the hell were you guys for the last decade and a half?
Yeah.
Could have used your help, uh, White Knight 69, Triple X. Like, what the hell? You didn't see us over here messing around trying to figure this crap out? Uh, but yeah, we kind of forgot about it and put Afghanistan and Iraq from our minds. And I still get shocked looks today when I mention that there are American troops operating and fighting the war on terror in Africa. So, Africa, that's a continent, it still exists.
Yeah.
So we put a lot of this from our
Or the
mind.
fact that we were conducting drone attacks in Yemen.
Yes, and Yemen is a horrifying story, one of the most horrific civil wars I think you could possibly imagine that
Oh,
no
yeah.
one talks about.
And
Uh,
has been going on since what, like the 1950s almost.
yes, and this is an excellent point. Yemen is an excellent point, I think, because what is Al Qaeda? Is I think the first question we need to answer because we told ourselves that Al Qaeda is terrorists and they're bad guys, and we have to go fight the bad guys, and everyone's like, okay, and they didn't ask any more questions, right?
Yeah, because Saddam Hussein was obviously Al Qaeda too.
Uh,
That's why we invaded Iraq, wasn't
uh, God, I didn't even want to get to that yet,
it?
but yes, it's been a very long 20 years. If you see
uh,
us ever out and about, just buy us a drink. Anyway, Al Qaeda is a Shia Muslim supranational organization. And I say this with a particular emphasis. They are pan Arabic. They want to bring about a caliphate comprised of every Muslim who's ever lived, except the Sunnis who they're going to kill. Um, so, that's a little awkward. But this is a group that is dedicated to this goal. And they're looking around at the Arab world, the Middle East especially, and they're asking themselves what's happening here? What is stopping us from doing this thing? And they come up with an answer. The answer is, well, Saudi Arabia. And we got Saudi Arabia. There's Mecca, and we need Mecca, and they've got it, and they're not going anywhere anytime soon. Why aren't they
It's
going
got
there?
all that oil, which will give us all the money we need to accomplish our goals.
Yes. Why are they not going anywhere anytime soon? Well, they lived through the 90s too, and they saw when Iraq blinked in the general direction of Saudi Arabia, what happened. Like even anywhere close, like one country over, what happens? Half the world comes and blows up the Iraqi army, led by the United States. And that's kind of like what they're observing. So, like, why are we attacking America? You might ask, from Al Qaeda, and the answer is, to them, a destabilized America is a prerequisite for accomplishing their actual goals. So,
Yeah, and I think something that needs to be mentioned, it doesn't make the press almost at all, but there's a lot of, uh, for lack of a better word, insurrectionist activity inside Saudi Arabia.
yes, it's not a
There
happy
are,
place.
yeah, there's lots of assassinations and bombings and such that we in the outside never hear about because the Royal House of Saud makes damn sure that those pieces of information are suppressed.
Their media operation is much better than the Republicans.
Oh, yeah.
For example, we learned about George Santos's own in-house opposition research. Uh, Never ever anyone ever speak to me again about how the liberal media is so unfair to Republicans. I don't want to hear it. So, Saudi Arabia is kind of like a big factor for Osama bin Laden, um, and apparently 9/11 hijackers because they all came from there. But like Osama bin Laden doesn't spring up out of the ground, right? And this kind of gets into why I think we by and large bungled talking about this with people. Like Osama bin Laden doesn't spring up out of the ground. He comes from somewhere, and he has a story. And whether you agree with it or not, like 9/11 is a horrible event. It's obviously burned into the consciousness of Americans, and by and large the rest of the world too, because we like to drag everyone along with us when we do things. We're nice that way, very inclusive. Uh,
Mhm.
but Bin Laden isn't just 9/11, right? He has done things beforehand. He is a man who used to put his own wealth into building infrastructure in the Middle East. He personally worked alongside people and dug roads. Like, he had attributes about him, and this is why people followed him and why he was considered charismatic. His attributes about him that you would consider something worth emulating in most cases, like being willing to work with people in the trenches, doing those sorts of things. There's a lot to more to just this topic than, oh, Bin Laden's letter is based, or Bin Laden's horrible and we shouldn't read him. Uh, so this is a history channel ostensibly, even though I don't seem to do much history anymore. But that ends tonight because I made you a little fancy graphic that I'm putting on the screen now. The two guys talking history, 5 C's of historical thinking graphic. And we don't actually own the concept of the 5 C's. You'll find it in virtually every college you'll ever visit that teaches history, right? And these are 5 framing devices for the questions you should ask about history, and when ask about current events too, because when people are referencing history, like a 20-year-old letter written by Osama bin Laden, we need to ask ourselves these questions, right? The 5 C's of historical thinking. The first is change over time. How does our analysis and our world change? And how does this affect how we might look at one event in one time and how we might look at the exact same event in an entirely different time? Causality. What causes things to happen? I had a history teacher in high school who did a great thing, and I asked him if he still had it before embarking on this great journey because it was cool. Uh, he did for as AP European history class a web of events. He listed out all the things that you talk about on the AP test, and he drew lines between them like a crazy guy with a cork board and the red string, right? Which events are related and which ones aren't. There's a lot of times what'll happen when you get somebody who talks about history and they didn't look at the thing too closely and they're just a couple hours done on Wikipedia, right? They'll talk about events that happened after as if they had been caused by events that happened before. And this is famous post hoc ergo propter hoc, right? After
Yeah.
it, therefore because of it, which is oftentimes not true at all. For example, I had a friend who was born on January 2nd of 1986. A few days later, the Space Shuttle Challenger goes up and explodes. It would not be logically sound to say that the birth of my friend caused the explosion on the Challenger. All right, that was a little funny.
But can you be sure?
Well, she did cause an awful lot of trouble, so possibly.
See.
The next one is context. Yes. What is the context surrounding that? And we've talked a little bit about the context surrounding the letter. There are a couple really interesting passages in there, I think, that kind of illustrate that the United States and Israel in particular, despite the fact that that was a takeaway because everyone's watching Hamas, the United States and Israel in particular are kind of like tertiary to Osama bin Laden's considerations. Like, he spends a good portion of time ranting about Chechnya, which was being attacked by the Russians in the 90s and early 2000s. So is this
And yet
thing...
he chooses to attack us and not Russia. Why is that? Because Russia's a hard target. We're a soft target.
Yeah, this is the era of that Lucy, a friend of this channel, talked about the other day. The school, where Chechen terrorists take over the school, and the Spetsnaz response is extreme, to say the least. But are you getting the context of the story is important, right?
Yeah, I agree.
And this is one of the biggest things, I think. This is the thing I keep hammering again and again for the last year, and will probably do so until I decide to find a real job. Um, Context is so important. Like what is the wider context? Some of you in the audience, I know Palm Dad's here, will remember a few months back, I went on and I did a thing, right? It was a show on Wick TV where we debated whether or not American hegemony is a good or a bad thing. And I and several Europeans, for some reason, there were no Americans, other Americans doing this, were arguing for. Actually, they were Eastern Europeans, so I understand why they were arguing for American hegemony at that point. Because they're all going like, "Oh, that Russia is looking awfully, awfully handsy over there." Uh, and what ends up happening, it was a train wreck. I've noticed that my audience enjoys clocking the exact moment in debates when my soul leaves my body. Uh,
Oh, okay.
yes, just that moment where I just go, "Oh God, we're in for it now." And my essential
What have I
argument,
done now?
about this is, and I don't get to make it nearly as much as I wanted to, is American hegemony is preferable to, and we are a much more fair-minded and even-handed hegemon than it has ever existed in history. It is much more preferable to Russian or Chinese hegemony, um, which apparently was insufficient according to the opposition. But then they turned around halfway through and granted my point, so I think I win, right? I win, right? That's how that works.
I think so. Makes sense.
Anyway, context matters because, like, if you try to take this story of like, is America a force for good out of the context of the rest of the world, like you can sit here and list bad things that have happened in history all day, and I don't ever try to minimize those here, but uh, that's not the end of the story. Like, America's past with our indigenous people isn't the end of the story, and should tell it better, and we should give agency to our indigenous people, and we should give agency to black slaves. We should do all those things, and when we tell these stories, but those stories in and of themselves do not damn us any more than Osama bin Laden's letter damns us. That's just not how this works.
Yeah.
Uh, and that leads into part 4, which is complexity. And all of these things, like every time I get up to do this show, I feel insufficient to the task at hand. I will always forever feel imposter syndrome, and if I stop doing that, it's probably time to quit. This is hard stuff to talk about. There's never enough time for me to stick in my hour to an hour and a half long shows. How like all the threads are impossible to pick up. Like, we talk about Saudi Arabia, but we need to talk about Yemen right below Saudi Arabia and Oman, and like all those things factor into one another uh, in a very real way. Um,
Yeah.
it's like that's why I've particularly enjoyed these last few times when me, Hetman, and Commander Macmillan have gotten here, because we can all play off of one another, and nobody has to bring the whole picture to the table, right? Because
Well,
it's
I
a
think
big
another
picture.
part of the problem there is that Americans like to have everything simplified. So you take these enormously convoluted, complex, historical, global situations, and they want to distill it down to, a single soundbite, one little slogan that solves all the problems. And it's so unrealistic to be thinking in those terms. But that's what a lot of people want.
Yeah, I think an excellent example this week has come up where you have certain figures who I dislike immensely poo-pooing the concept of a single state solution because it's too complicated for Palestine and Israel. And like, it could never come about, and like, America doesn't have the ability to execute that. And I just kind of point out, like, okay, but Germany is a single state. We played a fairly significant hand in welding that together.
Mm-hmm.
Why is Germany's single state solution possible as opposed to a two-state solution? Or more historically apt for the vast majority of the German-speaking people's existence, a 16-state solution, right? That,
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
it's too complicated is not a sufficient answer to the problems that we face. Uh, it's not a it's a perfectly sufficient answer if you want to snipe at one another on social media, but
Yeah.
a it's not the end of the equation. It's too complicated means that people have to give a major shit and get in there and figure it out. That's what like I I started this, and Hetman and I we talked about this a lot. Is we're very afraid for the state of historical education in America. It's getting squeezed out in university. It's getting made low priority, or worse, it's being used as a vehicle for teaching ideology, and it's not.
That I think is the biggest problem is that both sides see the other side as using history as a weapon.
Yes,
So you
it's
you doctor the story, you include enough truth to make it semi plausible and semi correct, but then you say things that have no support, but you say that's the way it had to be, and it gets people riled up. And I think that's what is the fundamental issue is people are using history for purposes that truly speaking history was not intended for.
you cease at that point being a historian and you become Homer.
Yeah,
You become the myth
yeah,
maker.
yeah.
And that's a problem. Like this thing, this is really basic, like 100 level course college stuff we're talking about here. But it's so absent from so many people's frameworks for talking about things. It's so important because these are the kinds of things that make history valuable. Uh, I saw a great survey the other day from one of the colleges here in Colorado of their history majors and like how much money they were making. And a lot of them weren't doing history related jobs, but they were making really good money being analysts. Like a good history education makes you a superb analyst.
Yeah.
And like this
Being a
is
history major.
yeah, not that the lot of us here aren't biased or anything.
Yeah, no, 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 of course not.
Just a little. And that's something to talk about too. I think while we're on this topic, everyone's biased. You can come around here and accuse me of any number of biases, and we're going to get to one of them in a minute, in the last bit here. Uh, but everyone's biased. I'm just upfront about it. I'll tell you what my biases are, and you can go from there, and you can take a look at what I say, and you can judge it from that, and I'll stand by it. Like I invite you to go look at other people. I've never on this channel once, despite being incredibly critical of other figures online, told you not to watch somebody, right? Never happened. I will never do that. I'm not going to tell you
Yeah.
not to go watch someone. And eventually, you know what's going to happen? Eventually, someone's going to notice this little project of mine, and they're going to screech about it. They're going to get so mad. They're going to make videos about it, and I'm not going to tell you not to watch them either. I hope that what I provide for people is the opportunity to look at things
And think.
and think. That's what I want to do. Um,
Yeah.
that's gonna be the case. Again, if I stop doing that, I need to quit. And the final, let's get to the final C is contingency, and this is one of my favorite concepts actually because people mess it up all the time, and it's a really fun leadership concept too because it's a great teaching tool. What events are dependent upon each other? What has to happen for the next thing to happen? How do they lock together? How do they explain one another? Contingency,
Yeah.
this is how you put together a historical account. These are the questions you start asking before you start researching something, right? Uh, these are the questions we had the opportunity to ask if we weren't screeching at each other about Bin Laden bad. Yes, the terrorist leader is probably not a nice guy. I grant you that. Let's
You
let's
think?
let's move on. Let's try to get something productive done today. Uh, that's, this is what we have to kind of do. This is what we kind of got to teach to. This is what I try to take forward when I do contemporary military analysis too. Like, how
Yep.
do I put these things in the context? And I think if you look back, you'll find we do that. Uh, there's so much education that is going into this channel between him and myself and the commander now, of like we've got combined decades of experience at this point between the lot of us, several, probably more than we wish to name out loud. So I want to, again, I want to thank everybody who watches this show regularly too, because you're great. You're a great audience. That's why I targeted the people I targeted. Um, you ask good questions. No one's fought too hard with me yet, and despite your best efforts, you haven't totally exhausted me. So I appreciate that. I hope we can kind of continue with this in the future. Uh whether I talk about, I don't necessarily want to tempt the wrath of the YouTube gods by directly talking about the contents of Bin Laden's letter. Um, Suffice it to say, you're perfectly willing to go to TikTok and judge for yourself whether or not what is being said has validity. I was not terribly impressed by any of the interlocutors in yesterday's debate. And I am very suspicious of the fact that the entire thing blew up in the first place. This feels like a thing that someone is orchestrating.
Oh yeah.
Like I'm not entirely certain who. I kind of have a guess. Um, I actually I one of two guesses. Either or really works out well for them. Either Israel or Russia has said, "Oh, look at this. We should make this trend." So that's definitely something that probably happened. That's also something I think we should probably start to keep in mind more and more.
People using social media to sow
Yes,
chaos.
there is a great
Chaos
video
benefits their side.
by Anders Puck Nielsen. It's short. It covers a much longer paper that I read, and probably a lot of people who are in military history have read at this point. It's a very short 9-minute video. It covers the phenomena of liminal warfare. And liminal is everyone's favorite word these days, right? But it's a good word. Uh, this is the ability to attack a country without openly attacking them. Uh, the space in between war and peace, sort of like rivalry. And these social media operations that you saw in 2016 for Trump, and Russia was very good at this, exceedingly good at this before invading Ukraine. Um,
Yeah.
they missed some steps, probably because everyone's paying much better attention than they were before. Israel's very good at this too. A couple other countries, Iran, kind of, sort of, is good at it. They're a little heavy-handed sometimes. Um, it is this use of social media and this manipulation of these algorithms to get you mad, to get you to take sides in issues, right? Um, Towards an end. So Russia is rather legendary, and several other countries, and this makes people quite mad if you say it out loud, for manipulating elections. Like Russia obviously manipulates the Baltic countries' elections all the time. Probably had a hand in not this current Polish government, but the last Polish government getting elected. Definitely has
Hmm.
their finger on the scale for Viktor Orban.
Yeah, 100% on that.
And they do this, like they do this. They create the space. And I, I'm gonna go out on a limb, and you can reel me back in, Commander. Here's what kind of happened in 2016. It's not that Russian agents went in and changed the vote totals, but what they did, and they did this all throughout the election, is they took issues that you that you care about, and they amplified them. So, for example, they amplified the concerns about Bernie Sanders not getting a fair shake by the DNC, and they made sure to try to keep Hillary Clinton's emails in the news. And they don't have to do enough to change an outcome. They don't have to change the votes tallies, whatever. They just have to make just enough people disgusted with the process that they either don't participate or decide to vote for someone silly like Jill Stein. And that's what happened in 2016. And it's not like I
They
can say,
also there's a secondary part of that I think a lot of people miss though, because they play both sides of the fence. There was
yes,
plenty of Russian stuff that was pro Biden, believe it or not. The
yes,
idea is you try to get people so divided against themselves, so there is no civil discourse, so everybody hates the other side more than they hate the external factor that's trying to influence things and is actually actively aggressive on the international scene. You ignore them because you're so focused on your neighbor who you can't stand because he flies his American flag on the left side and you fly yours on the right, or whatever piss pot nothingness, you know. And that's what it is it's to sow chaos and division, because if we are focused inwards against ourselves, we cannot focus outwards against them.
yes. And I was about to make a joke about Rand Paul's neighbor, but I actually don't blame Rand Paul's neighbor. I'd probably commit a crime if I was Rand Paul's neighbor.
I
But you
think
get the
that's a
point.
reasonable. Yeah.
Yeah, it certainly tracks that someone, either one of them, Ron or Rand Paul, is a completely obnoxious homeowner. Like that tracks 100%. Uh, that kind of is going to bring me around to kind of like what I also want to talk about tonight, the last topic. Um, uh, and that's kind of like the other end of the equation. Like Osama bin Laden writes a letter about how horrible it is that America sticks its nose in everyone else's business. The natural question to ask is why? Um, uh, why do we do that? And this is one of those things. Oh, puppy, you have a puppy? Sorry, chat. Puppy, his name is Rand. I have a puppy. His name is Avery. He is currently hiding tonight, probably because he hadn't get to steal from the cats yet. Anyway, why do we do this? And kind of like what lessons did America learn from the world wars, and
Well, hell, I
why?
think you have to take it back to way before that. I mean, go back to the Barbary Coast operations and such. America will get involved when America feels that its business interests are being adversely affected.
Yes, we have kind of set up a system post-war, and we've spent a great deal of money and effort building the system and designing the points around it to be very beneficial to us because we learned a pretty necessary message. The message is what we have is kind of called, and it's incredibly complicated, and we won't talk about the whole thing other than like what I planned out and wrote out tonight. We have an international system of rules and expectations that you would be quite right to say we inflict upon other countries. And there's a reason for this. Like this is kind of like the answer to the question: why should I send my money to Ukraine or Israel or Africa or in the Middle East or wherever? We know that when we have rules and expectations and a system in place, the world is more stable. And that's good for you, right? That's good for me. So, for example, I want to kind of make this point out an event. We all just went through the COVID pandemic, and we all just went through a Russian-induced grain cost spike. Without an international system backing and making the world function as it does, those things become much worse. So everyone kind of remembers how supply chains got disrupted after COVID because everything shut down and like things got funky with cost and etc. That happens a lot more in history before we get involved with this international system, post-war system, right? That's a regular everyday occurrence. So like the food on your plate is vastly shifting in price all the time. These kinds of things are like very common in American economic history. And the reason is we understand increasingly that we are in a global world with a global trade network. So like, what does that kind of mean for the United States? The first thing is, I think, and Commander Vermillion will probably want to speak to this at some length, is the United States Navy functionally exists primarily to ensure freedom of trade and free flow of capital throughout the world. They're freedom of the seas, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is a big part of what the Navy does. And why does America do this? And why does America do this for everyone, right? It's not like we protect our own trade. We protect everyone's trade as a function of our naval operations, right? Because it makes that rules-based order possible. So you sit there and you look at the Navy, and there are legitimate things to say about some of the Navy brass's choices as far as fleet composition goes. There are questions.
Don't get me started.
Yeah, there are questions you can ask, but the question isn't like, is the Navy too big? The Navy's probably not quite big enough, because we have taken for the first time in history, there's a country that has as its primary purpose on the high seas facilitating trade, right? It's an important system. And I talked a little bit about bias, right? Here's one of my biases. I presuppose that this international order is good and it overall a net positive. Because it doesn't just allow for you and me here in the States to enjoy benefits. We have other countries are able to trade with each other. This grain crisis from Ukraine was a disruption of grain to Africa. They're getting from the breadbasket of Europe food sources that they wouldn't otherwise have. It's a very powerful system. Or take like money you spend on NASA, right? And everybody knows NASA is the guys who went off in rockets and grabbed moon rocks or built the shuttles. But they also have hundreds of thousands of programs, all of which you could go look at, right? For free. Anyone in the world can go look at for free, devoted to finding better ways to address things here on Earth using space, satellite imagery, satellite studies, agricultural studies from satellites. All these things are possible because we engage in this kind of practice. If you want to rebut me at this point or agree with me, now is the time.
I'm agreeing with you without having to say, yeah, I think you're right. I think, though, that a better description might be it's enlightened self-interest more than anything else.
Absolutely, yes.
Because I think if you go back and you look at many of these wars that we have gotten involved with, they tend to be economic reasons behind it, and it's not the economy of Joe Main Street. It's the economics of the very wealthy that tend to get threatened, which cause us to intervene. So you were saying World War I. Why did we get involved with World War I? Well, because
we had to make sure someone could pay our debts.
Yeah, that too, but also because our ships were being sunk on the high seas.
Yes.
Those evil Huns were sinking everybody's ships, and nobody really cared that the people were dying so much as the people whose businesses were making all this stuff were losing money. And they're the ones whose influence is what's going to control how we decide how, you know, our forces are allocated, our international posture, etc.
Yeah, I actually that was kind of what I wanted to talk about next as part of this, and this is the part that's going to make people real. Uh, World War One and World War Two are excellent examples. Like, and I think like you could say that broadly. Like people pretend that war is economic is a big realization, and like it's a
Mhm.
pretty milquetoast observation, or from where I'm sitting. Like,
Say
yeah,
hello to Clausewitz.
yeah, I got this German guy on my bookshelf who agrees with you, and this Swiss guy too, incidentally. Like wars are not questions of morality. That's just after the fact. Like we might argue about ethics and morality in the conduct of wars, and that's relevant to this too. But one of the reasons we continue to do this and we build these vast networks of alliances, like, because I think a fair question for someone to ask is, well, if we talk about World War One, we talk about the causes of it, and we say that this alliance network was a cause, right? And you're like, sure, yes, straw man, that's true. Uh, so a fair question might be, well, America has assembled this network of alliances, right? How is this not precipitously causing a global conflict or a possibility for causing a global conflict? I'm like, excellent question, Strawman. The answer to this is America has my military history instructor for ROTC had a pretty good way of putting it. We operate on the sine wave of international relations for much of our history. We don't care, don't care, don't care, leave us alone, leave us alone. Oh, crap. We got to go take care of this problem. Build big military. Collapse big military. Don't care, don't care. Sine wave.
Yeah.
It's plottable and predictable. So like you mentioned the Barbary Pirates. Let's go even back. The Monroe Doctrine. Don't care. Barbary Pirates. We do care. Uh, World War One. Prior to 1917. Don't care. 1917. Do care. And we've always been capable of like marshaling a great amount of resources because we are in fact sitting on a great deal of other people's land that we've taken over. It's ours now. Congratulations. And so we have a great deal of resources and industrial base, and we can do that. Let's put together a massive army and ship it off to Europe in under a year. Totally feasible. Uh, did
Yeah.
it again in World War Two. But here's the thing: World War One was a pretty costly war for us for just the length of time that we were in it, which wasn't that long. World War II also. America has learned, I think, because we've never been this way again for World War II. It's no longer a sine wave. It's just boom, we're there. If we ignore problems outside of the world, that doesn't mean they're not coming to our doorstep. So it doesn't behoove us to turn a blind eye to these things because what will happen is we will get involved and it will cost more at the tail end of this than it ever would have had we gotten involved from the beginning. Um,
Yeah, it's a
so
refutation of the whole concept of appeasement, basically.
yes. And so like you have NATO, and NATO's a massive alliance. The purpose of NATO is ostensibly to fight the Russians. But more importantly, it's to make the prospect of war unappealing for Russia. And like you see this like in the justifications of fighting Ukraine. It's like, oh, it's about NATO expansion. NATO's threatening our borders. No, NATO's not going to go over your borders. They don't care. And in fact, it's telling that of all the targets you could have possibly picked, you pick a target that's not a NATO country, which is
Yeah.
a really good advertisement for joining NATO, as Finland and Sweden discovered. And we do the same thing out east with China. We
I
got
mean, seriously,
Japan.
if anybody as little as 5 years ago had told you that Sweden and Finland would join NATO, they would have laughed you out of the building.
Oh yeah, traditionally very neutral. We're gonna take the Russians on our own, except for Finland, who had that weird Nazi phase in the 40s. And I don't actually blame Finland for joining the Axis powers because, like, got to kill Russians. Good deal for them.
Yeah. After what you did to us in the Winter War, well, we're going to do it in the Continuation War.
Seems reasonable.
Yeah.
I also like awkwardly, Finland is the only country I know that took German equipment and deployed it with swastikas on it. It's like Falcon Ruse for everyone else, but you get the swastika. Uh, they were exuberantly grateful for those German tanks.
Oh, yeah.
Exuberantly grateful. But let's not talk about that because again, it's awkward. We're back to complexity. Hey, hey.
Can't have that.
Anyway,
Simplify.
anyway, you build this alliance network, and now Russia has to weigh the cost because Russia's a revisionist power, and it's not terribly happy about the state of world affairs, and it would like to be in charge. And this is a fairly consistent Russian goal for most of the 18th and 19th centuries and 20th and 21st. And they're just so damn bad at it. Not for lack of trying. China's the same way. China would like to be seen as the next great superpower. And China's probably a house of cards that's going to collapse in on itself, and that's a different story. But the United
Yeah.
States, they set up, like China has territorial ambitions on Taiwan and the Philippines and Vietnam, and we'd very much like them not to do that. So we get together with Vietnam and Japan and the Philippines and Australia, and we form in Taiwan, and we basically form this network. It's like, here is the cost of war. Here's what you go against. Do you think you can take the world? And
Yeah.
this has largely worked. To be perfectly blunt, it's been effective. We have seen. I know things look bad right now. Like I'm spending an awful lot of time talking about wars, and I will forever do so. But I'm talking about small wars, a civil war in Sudan, an uprising in Myanmar, a war in Armenia, a war in Ukraine. This is the biggest one we've seen in generations. This scheme has kept wars small. You don't see this global conflagration like you do in those Second and First World Wars, right? It's just not.
Or World War Zero.
Uh, which one are you counting that as?
That's the basically the French and Indian War. The
7 Years War.
uh,
Yeah.
yeah,
You can either
all over
call
the
that
place.
one or that one's also big economic war.
Yeah.
Very big economic war. You don't see these global conflagrations. It doesn't happen. Um, so like when you ask me what is American hegemony good for? Well, in the nuclear age, it's kept the prospect of nuclear war at bay. Like this, this isn't the end result of this equation is not necessarily always great. But I feel like the benefits have outweighed the negatives. And
Yeah.
the negatives can still be improved. Like there are more opportunities. And it's complex, and we're gonna have to sit down and have hard discussions to improve these things. But it doesn't end like if America sticks its fingers around for very good reasons. And it's
Well,
good for you.
I think it extends beyond just preventing nuclear war. I think it also includes the fact that this is one of the longest periods in European history that you haven't had a major war.
Yeah, there's been no general war in Europe for nearly a century
Yeah.
at this point. This is actually statistically one of the most peaceful periods in human history. Someone asked
Yeah, but
recently.
listen to the nightly news and you'll think otherwise.
Well, that's a different but related story. This is, without a doubt, one of the most peaceful periods in human history overall. And, that's what the Pax Americana brought us. Uh, it's not. I'm not being big-headed when I say that America has had some of the most significant impacts on our world that any country ever has. And there are things to talk about. There are problems here. There are problems abroad that we've caused. Absolutely. But but we cannot throw those things aside uh, because they would make us a little uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Because like, and that's kind of why I assume as a good thing this international order. And we've done a lot of stuff. You'll see a lot of people complaining about the gold standard thing we did, and again, that's another part of it that I don't really want to get into because anytime you talk about the gold standard, the crazies come out. But like, that's why I think it's valuable. That's why I cannot come in and automatically assume the worst of things. Why when it's never going to be what our coverage is.
Well, it's the way I look at it, and I hate the analogy, but it's effectively true, is America ends up being the global policeman because the neighborhood is now more crowded than it used to be. And somebody needs to keep, the gangs from forming and people from robbing the store and yada, yada, yada.
Yeah, I
And
think that's
we stood up and said, well, we'll take on the role since none of the rest of you will.
yes. Because guess what? There's opportunity caused when the gang forms, right? Right?
Yeah.
Everyone knows it. Everyone knows it. And then that's let's also make people even matter still by drawing this down on a particular level. Is police reform required? Absolutely. But that
Yeah.
reform is not abolish the police. It's a complicated and hard question, and it's going to have to be a hard topic. And I don't want to leave it to either the writers of Blue Bloods or the mad people online.
Good way of putting it.
That show is absolutely buck wild to me, right? Blue Bloods.
Yeah.
Here's the thing. I started watching it when I was younger, and it was honestly a better show then. And I have this weird thing where if I start a thing, I have to finish it.
Uh-huh.
So I'm going to watch the last few seasons of Blue Bloods as they sputter to their death, even though at this point it's basically just a Republican news hour.
Yeah. Well, I think that in itself is another question. Is it still the same Republican Party?
Nope.
And if it isn't, what is it?
Excellent.
I mean, it's definite. It's definitely glommed onto the old name, but
it's
I think
something.
Yeah, it's something, but I don't think anybody's really sure what it is. Even the Republicans, I don't think, know what it is.
There are like we'll sit here and say mean things about Republic Hetman less so because he's a little bit more conservative than you and me. Say mean things about the Republicans, but there are Republicans in history I admire, like LaGuardia or Abraham Lincoln. Like there are people in American history who were Republicans who are absolutely admirable figures. Overall, really, like obviously no one's a saint, but and there are Republicans who every once in a while, right now, have glimmers of doing the right thing, right?
Yeah, but
like I have to
again, I
remind
think
myself
the issue is when you start talking to people. I have, being a naval officer, many of my fellow naval officers, I would say the majority, were Republican. But you talk to these people, and they literally say they don't recognize their party. They're adrift in the American political system because there really isn't a conservative party anymore. There's this combination white supremacist, ultra-nationalist, proto-fascist party, and then all these other people who, because of tradition, are still saying, oh yeah, I'm a Republican, but...
Yes, absolutely.
And so many of them are saying, no, I think I'm an independent now.
I would actually really be deeply interested in a survey of serving military officers. Not so much enlisted, because I have a feeling I know how that breaks down without looking. Serving military officers across all the branches who are Republican or Democrat. And like it's uncouth to ask, right? Because,
Oh yeah.
we all get that lecture at some point in officer training about the apolitical military officer corps, right? So it's like not really polite to ask. Um, but like,
I think it even goes further. There's a history of military officers not even voting because they thought that just casting a ballot was showing
inappropriate, yeah.
inappropriate favoritism for one side or the other, and you were supposed to be neutral. I mean, I don't know if it's true, but one of the apocryphal tales was the first time Eisenhower ever cast a ballot was when he voted for himself.
Yeah, there is a lot. There's also a culture I noticed over the years of interacting with people. Uh, it's much more socially acceptable to be conservative in the military out loud than it is to be liberal out loud.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean there aren't liberals in the military. They're just real quiet about it, like hush hush. Um,
What's interesting to me is the number of people that I served with that have said post career that they're, a Democrat or a liberal or what have you. And all the time you thought, oh, they're just, another one of those moderate Republicans. They weren't. They aren't.
yeah, I actually, like I said before the stream, I was talked to a lot of young women who went up with in officer training, and knew kind of privately came to me to vent about Dobbs that I did not actually necessarily expect. Um,
Yeah.
and that was really where I also got a sense that the Republicans run for a walloping in the next election too. Like, wait, aren't you conservative? Yep, but I'm pissed. Uh, uh, like it was like remarkable to me how many people, and like these were conversations I was having, like borderline conversations even when I was a cadet, right, about some of these
Yeah.
things, because I've always been a kind of a politics nerd. So like I was having very borderline conversations up to the point like the year my third year when I couldn't continue on, when I got denied. It's like a couple weeks before the election was rolling around the end of the semester. It was a couple weeks before my battalion commander called me down to his office. And like I was doing my training duties and whatnot, so I wasn't quite sure what was going on. And he just wanted to talk to me about the fact that he had the opportunity to fill out a ballot and vote on American soil for the first time in 10 years.
Mm.
It was a really interesting conversation. Um, because it's not good. Like if you're not experienced with the military at all, generally when someone of Commander McMillan or a Lieutenant Colonel calls you to their office, you've messed up. So like you hit this like even if you didn't do anything, and you didn't do anything, you get this pit in your stomach as you're heading down there. It just happens. You don't know what's coming, right? It's always a surprise when a field grade officer calls you to their office. I think it's
Yeah.
unfair to give people heart attacks like that, but here we are.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Uh,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think, no, I was going to say, I think that, and I think it's definitely going to be regional, but I mean, do most of my shopping at the local commissary and exchange. Well, not the exchange, but definitely commissary.
You don't like sales tax
Um,
either?
yeah, exactly. But I kind of do a informal seat of my pants survey when I drive into the parking lot. And these are not just active duty people, it's just other retirees like myself who were shopping on base. And you look at the cars and you look at the bumper stickers. And in 2016, I was surprised not to see a huge number of, Trump stickers, but there weren't. There were very few. and
Yeah.
and it was kind of surprising to me.
I think the mechanics of 2016 got away from us. Um,
Yeah,
right? Because you have a Democratic president who is marginally popular, and you've had him for 8 years. Um, you should expect, just off mechanics alone, the Republican to win. But we
yeah,
all sat there and we looked, and it's like it's Donald Trump. No way. Like, how is this happening? This is like a fever dream, right?
yeah, exactly.
And I remember that night really well, actually, because it was like I sat down to start looking at results as they came in, and uh, the results come in, and Hillary Clinton projected to win. Hillary Clinton projected to win. Hillary Clinton projected to win, and boom, shifts, like it starts slipping away, and
Yeah,
and and you're watching this happen in real time, particularly if you turn on the New York Times dial tracker thing that they do. You're watching it happen, and like you can't believe your eyes, right?
yeah.
And the thing I remember most is the morning after. I wake up and it I thought it hadn't happened, like I dreamed it for a second, right? And then it just hits me and I'm sick to my stomach. And like
Yeah.
it was a really weird experience. Like, because I'm really good at, after all these years of, doing this military history thing, I'm really good at kind of sitting on the sidelines and being really clinical about contests, because you kind of got to. This hit me like really unexpectedly hard when it happened.
Hmm.
Um, like really hard. Like I had a hard time reconciling what happened. Um,
No, I totally get it. I
like
was kind of the same way. I mean, and just like you sit there and you're going, I can't believe that the people of this country are that stupid. And then very quickly, it was replaced with not stupid, disillusioned, and angry.
yeah, I think that was, I think I had a very similar reaction. And that's a really good point. Because our good friend Wick, for example, talking about all the anti-Semitism that's occurred and getting mad about the posters getting torn down. And he's like, yeah, these people who are tearing down posters are evil. I'm like, that's not the first thing I go to, though. I've tried to learn. I've tried to learn a lot about myself and like my inclinations and what I think about people when I see that. And it's easy to hate. It's easy to find them stupid. But what if they're just mad, right? What if they
Yep.
did this because they're angry? Then there's something there, right? Because like I'm angry too about things. I get angry every time I look at a medical bill. Uh, we don't even want to talk about the concept of medical
No,
debt.
I can go on for hours. I prefer not.
Yes, but like I get it. Like that kind of comes back to what I was talking about earlier about empathy, right?
Yeah.
I can I can understand why you do it even if I don't agree with it. And a lot of people are still locked in this, oh, these Trump supporters are stupid and deplorable. And like yeah, voting for Donald Trump is probably not the greatest life choice, to be perfectly fair. It clearly did not work out well for a good number of people who died of COVID,
Possibly. Yeah, possibly.
allegedly. Anyway,
Allegedly. Oh, that's an even better choice of word.
it, but like I get it. I have to. I can't reach for that thing of. I cannot reach for that thing of the person across from me is cruel automatically. Like I know that's my first instinct, but it's not a good instinct, right? Because
Yeah.
I'm a Chicago boy, in heart and soul, city kid. Uh, I have a lot more in common with rural folks than I want to admit, though. Like, I can't reach for pretending that I'm so much better or different or whatnot. That's kind of like the lesson that we have to take from empathy, not to do that. Because guess what? The opportunity's here again this year, well, this coming year, to vote for Trump.
Hmm.
And I don't want to be that guy, but there's a chance he wins.
Yeah, there is. There's always a chance.
And if we didn't do the job of grappling with it uh, this last two times, like, we need to start asking the question now, or we're in trouble. Like, because even in 2020, Donald Trump has even losing has a record-breaking number of people turn out to vote for him.
Yeah.
Biden just happens to do a much better record-breaking job. Like even after everything we experienced for 4 years, 76 million people vote for Donald Trump. Like that's not nothing.
Well, I think I can't remember who it was. There was somebody who did an analysis, and they said that the average Trump voter has more in common with a, a Bernie supporter than he does with a normal, regular conservative Republican.
I can definitely see that, especially in foreign policy.
Yeah, and I thought that was a really interesting observation because if we assume Trump is the extreme on one side of the spectrum and Bernie is extreme on the other side, and yeah, I know, in Europe Bernie would be considered a centrist, but for America, I'm categorizing it that way. I think if you look at it from that perspective, then you see why the center in some ways is really not occupied by that many people. And what's ending up happening these days is the extremes are fighting over that small center group. And the center group, I think, is fighting desperately to maintain its viability and importance in a world that's increasingly going to the extremes.
Yeah, I just want to run back real quick to the Bernie being a centrist in Europe, but not in America. Context. See, we're doing the
Yeah.
five C's all over the place. Anyway, yeah, no, I think the big reason why I could never have supported Bernie Sanders, even if I liked his domestic policy, was because he's against that international based order that's so fundamental to American life that we just talked about. He's
Yeah.
like that Donald Trump gave it the old college try. We were really lucky that he was so inept, like, and that all these people around him were inept and like competing to be as inept as possible. Like,
Yeah,
really lucky. That worked out really well for us.
I think that's one of the takeaway lessons learned that the American oligarchy has learned is the next time we push our candidate into power, let's make sure we get somebody in there who has half a functioning brain cell.
Yeah, and like the other thing about the Trump administration that was really interesting was all these figures who joined it, who like I would otherwise be well disposed towards, except for that. Like Mattis, James Mattis is a great example of a person who I'd be relatively well disposed toward, other than, well, why the fuck did you work for Trump? Oh, then you find out that he's basically playing volleyball over there in the Defense Department, trying to stop things from happening.
Yeah.
uh, Stuff like that, and a couple other figures pop to mind. I've talked a little bit about the roller coaster I had about General Milley, right? So like during the BLM riots, he's followed Trump out in in full uniform when they did the tear gas and clearing. And I'm like, wait,
Yeah, I remember that.
what are you doing? Like we all have the talk. We have the talk about apolitical military, right? Right? What's happening right now? And there's a great article, and I linked it for
Mr.
somebody.
President, you can't do this. I'm the president. I can do whatever I damn well feel like.
There's a great article
Okay.
about it's called Trump versus Generals or something in a magazine. I have it somewhere. It talks extensively about what Milley was up to between that time when that happened and January 2021. Um,
hmm
and like he acknowledges that it was a mistake, which was really like I felt a lot better after I read that he had understood that what he did was not a great plan. And then it talks extensively about the hoops he jumped through for all those months from the summer of 2020 to, uh, all the way up to January, the inauguration, right?
hmm
All the hoops he jumped through to try to make sure that Trump A keeps us out of a war and B that they don't try to invoke the Insurrection Act to take over the country. And I'm like, this man just like privately probably pushed the bounds of his commission pretty far and
Oh, yeah.
saved his country. And he's going to be reviled for it. Like he should get a goddamn medal.
Well, one of the things that I think is interesting is you look at Trump's declarations about what he'll do when he gets reelected, and purging the officer corps is one of the top things in his agenda.
Yeah, they're going to have a problem with that. Um, when I spoke about the surveying officers, the
hmm
young officers coming up out of the academies are much more progressive openly than ever before. Uh,
Oh, yeah.
Ridiculously so. And there's a cohort now who's hitting '04 and '05 who's been very secretly progressive. Um, you're not going to get them all, Trump. It's just not going to happen. Plus, you,
Yeah, but he is convinced that they're all on his side. The
yeah,
youngsters are his voter bloc, and
it's not going to happen.
it's really yeah. Well, it's hard to find young people that really are of that mindset anymore. I'm sure if you go to as the Democrats, you know, like to say, and I think it's a horrible term, but the flyover states, they tend to feel that kind of isolation and uh, being ignored by the system. So yeah, they definitely favor a Trumpian equation.
Also,
But I
not
think if you
necessarily the people who join the military. Some
yeah,
half
but
and half. One of
yeah,
the things I always like kind of push back on is the assumption that people join the military because it's their only economic opportunity. A whole lot of people who would be broadly considered middle class end up joining the military, like a lot. You definitely
yeah,
do get those cases, those hard luck cases, but a lot of people. I think a great example is Generation Kill, right? The book
hmm
by Evans. He talks extensively about the unit, the Rage or the Marsoc unit. It wasn't Marsoc then, but it's now Marsoc. The Marsoc
yeah.
unit he's in, and the Marines in it, right? And he expresses surprise several times at how many of them are like of a middle class background. Uh, it's
Well,
a fairly
a lot
decent.
of people don't realize you go back and you look at the early years of Vietnam, and surprisingly large portion of the U.S. military, even though we had conscription, were actually volunteers. And it's only after the bloodbath starts over there that suddenly they have to really start upping the conscription because they're not getting the volunteers anymore.
Yeah, that's a. I think most people have read about the American military recruiting crisis. And there's a couple things
Yeah.
that go into that, but like I think it's premature to call it a crisis because there's definitely a mechanism to address this. Um, you're just not going to like it much. Um, uh, and like that's kind of like the other thing to say is like that also I think speaks to the fact that being middle class ain't what it used to be, right? Um,
yeah.
Life's tough now. We I acknowledge that every month as I do the budget. Um, that's I think That's actually probably a pretty good topic while we're rolling through this and doing it. All volunteer military force that we are so very attached to these days. I don't think it's going to necessarily last. Um, I think you have
Yeah.
a twofold problem. The first is there's a lot of nonsense that goes into being in the military, a whole lot of nonsense, right? Um, which is now being actively commented upon by TikTok influencers who are in the military. So now people are seeing up front what they might be in for, and are a lot less likely to
Yeah.
want to do that. We did. I talked about here on this channel a couple months ago the utter disaster this summer that was at Fort Knox Cadet Command in feeding people and expired MREs and whatnot. Like these things are very
Yep.
public. And the other thing I think is we are not adapting as well to the reality of a near peer situation, which is what we're looking at now, than we ought to be.
Yeah. Very much so. I totally 100% agree
The
with you on
attitude
that.
isn't there. Like we did Iraq, and we're still in Iraq, kind of, sort of, but not really, and in Africa. But this, like we had this situation where a kind of undersized and underweight military worked, right? Because we didn't have to fight this war the same way. And that
Yeah.
won't be the case if Russia keeps getting spunky or China decides to get involved.
Absolutely.
Um, Good news, China signaled its lack of intent to invade Taiwan anytime within the next 10 years. So we got a little bit of a leeway.
I think you've heard my opinion on that.
Yes. Uh,
Yeah. I don't see it happening because Taiwan is the pressure valve on the pressure cooker of Chinese politics.
I had a conversation with a Chinese expat who had a very similar take. uh, which probably going to be the case, which is good because that would kind of push. We talked about you can have legitimate criticisms of the choices of the Navy Admiralty, and this a war with China would probably bring those out real quick.
Yeah.
Um, I'm staring at Saudi Arabia for some reason on my map. I don't know what's going on with my brain.
See,
Uh,
I think that is one of the big likely hot spots that we will get drawn into is the the huge tension between Iran and Saudi Arabia.
yeah, I think the Middle East is probably not. We're not done with that yet. Um, and there's kind of a corollary to that. And having already made people mad about police reform and American hegemony is not bad, actually. I'm going to go one step further tonight. Uh, there's a reason, there's a value to saying something like Ukraine, you need to follow the rules of war, or whatever, or any country, really. If you don't follow those rules of war, we won't help you. And we are pretty about this, like, um, generally. And it's become a factor that's very upsetting, I think, for a lot of people. A lot
Yeah.
was written this year, this 20-year retrospectives in Iraq, about the concept of moral injury and that it costs our soldiers to work with people who do not respect life, and don't respect the rules of war. Like I
Yeah.
read that
I
phrase a
totally
lot.
agree.
There's a lot of really good pieces that came from veterans of the war in the last couple of months, particularly that came out in April when like the anniversary of the war starts. And they talked about their experiences in Baghdad and their experiences working with these groups we worked with who were not great people. Um, and that kind of brings me back to our friends Israel and like kind of what's happening with this Bin Laden letter thing and how we're regarding Hamas, and like Hamas bad is like a popular opinion, but not the end of the story, right?
Yeah.
So here's the thing. I'm gonna say the thing. Israel is not nearly as strategically important to us as we like to claim, because it's not like there aren't other countries in the region that won't work with us. Saudi Arabia, again,
Jordan.
Jordan, Oman, the United Arab Emirates, Iraq. We've got a pretty good handle on that. Uh, Israel's not nearly as valuable to us as we like to claim. Yeah, they're the only democracy in the region. Like, okay, that's an ideological concern, and that does not a foreign policy make.
I think the real reason that Israel is, quote, important, unquote, is because of voting blocks in the U.S.
Yes, there's a domestic policy priority.
Yeah. And that's going back to the old Clausewitzian thing of war is an extension of politics. Most people think that's referring specifically to the international relations style politics between nations. But I extend it even further. I think the actually domestic side of that political equation is more important than the other.
I think that's a pretty good reading, honestly. I think that's not a reading that's done enough of Clausewitz and that particular section, but I think that's a very good reading. Um, but there is, here's the thing: there's a limit to what Israel can get away with. Eventually, there, eventually you will outpace the inconvenience that they are presently causing. Will outpace the political value of the voting blocks here. And
Oh,
there's eventually a point
absolutely.
where if they keep pulling this crap that they're doing right now, because oh my God, that's the other thing that happened this week. Have you been paying attention to the propaganda the IDF has been putting out? Uh,
Yeah.
it's insultingly bad.
Yeah.
Like we
It's so,
found
I mean,
rifles in an MRI room. Like what?
yeah, but I mean, it even more to the point, it's so heavy-handed, it's reminiscent of Stalin era propaganda.
Yeah, or they
That's how
did
bad it is.
late last night. They did a photo op in front of these rockets without nozzles. I'm like, did you guys just try to pass off parade rockets for demonstration purposes as a rocket site? Like, if we pan over, will
Yeah.
we find the Hamas marching band? Like, what's happening? I feel like I'm in crazy land. Or they bulldozed a building and found a Hamas tunnel, and I'm like, okay, you
Yeah,
found an exit that's going somewhere else, right? Nope, they found a cable duct for internet cables. Like, oh my
obviously a
god,
nefarious activity.
I
Yeah,
just was
it's
flattened this week by it. And like obviously the United States is saying, oh yes, we support Israel. They have a right to defend themselves. Blah 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 blah. All the same things we've been saying for the past 50 years. But you got to wonder at the
yeah,
State Department and DoD, there are conversations happening where people are going like we can't do this for much longer. Like that, you can outrun Netanyahu can outrun Israel's usefulness to the United States because it's not what he thinks it is. And
yeah.
there's a
That's
point where
very true.
there's a point where you can legitimately say, no, stop, no more. If you don't stop, we're going to stop you, and that becomes a possibility, a real possibility. And people have pretended, like a whole bunch of people were poo-pooing the concept of a single state solution because America will never challenge Israel's sovereignty. Like that ain't true. No, do not assume that this will always last forever. That the good times for Israel won't end.
Very true. Very true.
It's quite the thing, really. Uh, and that's like I think that's a huge. Iraq is another good. The invasion of Iraq in 2002 or 2003, excuse me, is another great example of times when we kind of went against the interests put upon us by this international rules based order. And that's a good
Hmm.
as reason as any not to invade Iraq or to support Israel. But we did it anyway. Like it's not like we don't necessarily act against our interests every once in a while. It just doesn't go well for us when we do.
Yeah. And I remember after the liberation of Kuwait, the first Gulf War,
I
when
was
we
three.
do, pardon?
I was three. I don't remember.
Yeah. But after that, when we'd go to any of the Gulf states, go to UAE, go to Bahrain, go to Kuwait, America was viewed as the great hero. We helped one of the small nations against a monster. And when we did the second Gulf War, when Bush sent us in on this ludicrous mission that we all knew was a lie from the beginning, we burned up almost all of that positive feeling.
Yeah, there's a lot to that though, I think, because Iraq was, not an insignificantly powerful country on paper in the 90s. Not after 91, like 80s maybe is a better put. Like they're openly challenging Iran, right? And fighting Iran prior to this.
They
And then
fought Iran and got bled white, and they needed to have money to pay back the people who'd given them all the guns.
yes,
Russia
so
was
they invaded
demanding
Kuwait.
payment. So take Kuwait. Get
It's a
all that oil.
it's basically the standard Hearts of Iron 4 player gambit, right? Uh, it's just like I got this stuff to invade Poland. Now I got to invade France, and on it goes. Anyway, the next thing you
Yep.
know, you're freezing, and it's 17 kilometers to Moscow.
I
Anyway,
can do it. I can do it.
uh, at any rate, so they have a massive army and they roll it into Kuwait, and then we obliterate it, right?
Yep.
And then we go, you know, 10 years later and re-obliterate it. The
Well, the
Iraqi
thing
army never
is,
recovered, right? Never really
the
recovered.
the right. The argument was we stopped when we did after we liberated Kuwait because that was what our UN mandate was for, and
Yes.
everybody that we were with, at least from the Arab side. And you have to remember, as bizarre as it was, we had Egyptian and Syrian and Saudi and UAE and exile Kuwaiti troops fighting on our side. Everybody expected we were going to go all the way to Baghdad and make Saddam go away. And they would have been perfectly fine with that because he was viewed as the monster who had disturbed the peace, that he had attacked a fellow Arab country, et cetera, et cetera. And we didn't. And then we waited that 10 years and did something even more colossally stupid.
And it was
I I
rough,
think we
right?
don't. Yeah, and I think we don't bother to try to read the room, as they would say.
Yeah, especially with the Middle East. We got really
Yeah,
bad after 9/11 about Islam in general.
yeah.
Understanding it. Like there was basically two.
Anybody who speaks or reads Arabic is obviously evil and must die.
Yeah, there was obviously like two huge divides that emerged. Is like people who are either like FBI or CIA or military who are making an effort, and not everyone in the military necessarily made the same effort.
Yeah.
Uh, and then everyone else who just overwrote it as wrong and evil, and like for a long time we treated Muslims as they were alien. Uh,
Yeah. Even worse, I would contend, is the fact that most Americans had no clue what a Muslim was.
yeah, there was a movie, and I actually like this movie a lot. It's of dubious quality for most people. Um, Denzel Washington Bruce Willis from the late '90s called The Siege. You might have
Oh
seen.
yeah, I've seen it. Yeah, I've seen it.
Fantastic movie. Poignant because of the world it describes and what happens in the movie.
Yep.
And very poignant in the attitude it takes. Like it just like whoops. Denzel Washington goes in the speech at the end, like as the movie's coming to a close and dealing with the kind of the final conflict of the movie, and like he's talking about this cycle of violence and lack of understanding between uh, Americans at large and Muslims in the Middle East. Um, I have Saudi Arabia sent. Don't tell anyone that. You can get in trouble. I tried to get a friend of mine to bring me sand from Afghanistan so I could set up my own embassy. Don't do that. Uh, anyway, oh,
Fell out of your chair laughing.
I constantly like I made cracks all the time when she was on the forward operating base. I'm like, yeah, they mortared us again last night. I'm like, you know what you guys should do that'd be really funny? You should just move everything 6 inches to the left so it throws off their mortar calculations. Just for fun, just entertain yourselves, right?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, but it was like a really poignant movie, right? Really well done, and like
Yes.
we haven't taken those lessons to heart. And like you would think
No.
we would have done that after 9/11 or after Afghanistan, we withdrew from Afghanistan. But here we are for the last month, basically doing the same goddamn thing. All over again, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
Seems to be our fate. Repeat the mistakes of yesteryear.
but it's like the mistakes of 20 minutes ago. Jesus.